Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jade here from Mindset Matters. Welcome to the weekend of wellbeing and my webinar. Today, I want to talk to you about stress mindsets. And the reason that I think this is an important webinar to do right now is that we're living in some unprecedented times. At this point in time, we are thinking about easing out of lockdown, and we're now in level 3, and we're starting to think more about connecting with other people, which is one of the things that I'm going to talk to you about today in terms of how connection is so important in relation to our stress response. Some of us might still be working from home. Some of us might be essential workers working on the front line. You might also be caring for children or caring for elderly relatives, but it's definitely a time where a lot of people are talking about how much more stress they feel. So I wanted to give you a webinar today that rethinks stress. And it comes from an evidence base out of Harvard University from 2012. And it's made all of us, myself included as a health and wellbeing practitioner, rethink how we talk about stress and also how we educate people about stress. Because there's been some fundamental changes in the research, and we need to start thinking about how we think about stress differently. So today we're going to talk about stress mindsets. What if I told you that everything that you've been taught about stress is wrong? And what if I told you that instead of fearing stress, we should actually learn to embrace it and appreciate it? What if I told you that the way that you view stress changes the way that your body responds to it? These are all really big statements, and they're pretty bold to make, but actually the research shows us that this is how we need to be talking about stress now. We've all been guilty of talking about all of the bad things about stress. I've spent many times on many different seminars and webinars talking to people about trying to avoid stress, trying to manage it, because we've talked too much about how it has significant negative health implications. But actually the research is now telling us something different, and it revolves around our mindsets, the way that we think about stress. We know that there is a mind and body connection in well-being. We talk about it in the form of holistic well-being, and stress is no different. Changing the way that you think about stress changes the way that your body responds to it. So that mind-body connection works in relation to a stress response. So today we're going to go through a process of rethinking stress. And over the course of the following slides, I want to take you on a bit of a journey of relearning. And what I'm hoping is that where we all are right now, in the midst of moving out of lockdown and feeling like our lives have changed significantly over the last couple of months, but looking forward to getting back to new normal, whatever that will look like, will hopefully be a new normal where you begin to think about the meaning behind your stress. How we view stress matters. And I talked a little bit at the beginning about how we've made stress the enemy. We've talked so much about avoiding it. We've talked about it in such negative ways, with such negative terminology. Too many of us talk about our stress as something that we don't want as part of our lives, that we want to get rid of. We often talk about if only we could get rid of the stress, we would be happier. But there's a couple of interesting things about that. One of the things that's interesting about that is if I sat here and asked you to reflect for a couple of minutes right now on the things that you find most stressful in life, I would probably imagine that for most people sitting in and listening today, work life and a work-life balance would be one of them. Childcare responsibilities and raising a family might be another. Caring responsibilities for elderly relatives might be another. Friendships and connections with other people might be something that brings you stress at points in your life. And if I sat here and said to you that tomorrow I could take all of those things away, I could remove the stress from your life, I want you to spend some time thinking about if you woke up tomorrow and all of that stress was gone, would there be any meaning left, or any joy, or any purpose? Because the interesting thing about us making stress the enemy is that we've forgotten to think about the meaning that stress brings. One of the health psychologists that was fundamental in changing my perspective on stress is a lady called Kelly McGonigal. And in her research, she reframes the concept of stress. And she talks about stress being something that arises when something that we care about is at stake. And that's a game changer, because we don't often think about the fact that when we feel stressed about things, it's because we care. It's because we want to do well, or we want to get something right, or we want to make sure things are good. And we want all of those things because we care about what's at stake. But we often forget to think about that meaning, to think about why we're doing something, to think about why we're stressed in the first place. So when we seek to avoid stress at all costs and we talk about managing it or getting rid of it altogether, we're failing to realize that a life without stress is a life without meaning. Because if we don't care about anything, then we don't have anything to bring us happiness. An interesting study that came out from Kelly McGonigal's research is that in countries where they rate their well-being as high, they also rate their stress levels as high. Countries that rate their stress levels of low actually have lower instances of well-being overall in the population. And so it shows us something quite fundamental, that when people care about things and they're invested in outcomes and the people around them and their relationships and their work, their productivity and their passions, whilst all of those things might make them feel stressed at points in their lives, they also bring them an incredible amount of purpose and meaning. So sometimes we find that the more stressed you are, actually the higher you score in terms of your general well-being. I want to talk about one study that changed it all in relation to how we think about stress mindsets. And it was carried out in 2012 at the University of Harvard. And in that study, they took 30,000 adults and they tracked them for 8 years. At the beginning of the study, they asked them 2 questions. The first one was, how much stress have you experienced in the past year? And the second one is, do you believe that stress is bad for your health? Over 8 years, they tracked all 30,000 participants, and to get an indication of how stress affects health, particularly negative implications of health, they then had to track the death records, which sounds really morbid, but I need you to stay with me on this one because it's a really important piece of information. At the end of 8 years, the findings that they had completely changed the way that practitioners like myself think about stress, talk about stress, and educate people about stress. Those participants that had the most amount of stress over those 8 years had an increased risk of dying from stress-related health complications, including cardiovascular issues, by roughly around 43%. However, that was only true for participants who believed that stress is bad for their health. And that's massive. It's a complete game changer in the way that we think about stress. The flip side of that is that those participants in the study that had what we would call a positive stress mindset, in that they don't believe that stress is bad for their health, had the lowest risk of dying out of all of the participants in the study, including those people that experienced relatively little stress over the 8 years of the study. So it wasn't the amount of stress that people experienced that resulted in negative health implications, particularly cardiovascular issues that can lead to early death. It was the fact that if they thought that stress was bad for them, their body responded in a negative way. And it was the bodily responses that led to negative health implications. How many times have we felt overwhelmed or felt stressed about something, and the bodily responses that we have in terms of our heart beating quickly, we're feeling short of breath, we feel a bit anxious, we perceive those as signs of anxiety, or we perceive them as signs that we're not coping well, we don't have the resources to be able to get us through. The interesting thing about those bodily responses is that what they found in the study is that actually an increased heart rate with a positive stress mindset prepares your body for action. It is literally pumping oxygenated blood around your body to increase your levels of alertness, to allow you to perform at your best. Your body is preparing you for action in the best possible way. It is supporting you to be able to do the best you can in a difficult situation. And yet when we think about stress from a negative perception, we talk about getting rid of those bodily responses. We tell people to calm down. We tell people to try and avoid situations that make them feel that way. But actually, everything about those bodily responses are positive. It is your body preparing you to rise to a challenge. If you view them differently, it changes the way that you think about how your body is working for you rather than against you. And that's incredibly important, because actually, when we change the way that our bodily responses and the way that we view them, we change the way that we think about our stress response. And in turn, our stress response changes the way we think about our health, and our health can be improved because of it. What I want us to do today, first and foremost, is to really get acquainted with our stress and how it shows up for us. To know where you are, in order to change where you're going, you have to get acquainted with how your stress turns up in your daily life right now. So there's a couple of questions on the screen that I want you to think about. One of them is, how does your mindset show up in everyday life? Our mind is an incredibly powerful tool, and it has an implication and an impact on our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. So when you have a mindset that feels negative, or that feels overwhelmed, or that views stress as bad for you, when that shows up in your everyday life, it can take what could just be a busy day and turn it into something that feels unachievable, that feels too much, that leaves us feeling that we aren't capable or we're not coping. The other thing is, how does that make you feel in yourself? Because actually, when that negative stress mindset shows up, we often feel overwhelmed. Those bodily responses show up and we perceive them sometimes to be anxiety. We tell ourselves that we're not able to cope with it, that we won't be able to see it through. How we think and talk about stress has profound implications on not only the way that we view it, but also the way that it impacts on us. The other thing that we are all guilty of, myself included, and I've done it many, many times, is playing stress ping pong with other people. We get into this weird communal mindset where we have like stress competitions with people. And, you know, one person will start and talk about how stressed they are. And then before you know it, everyone else is talking about how stressed they are. And then before long, everybody's stressed about their stress, which is just adding an extra layer of negativity within your mindset that you're taking into your day. And that in itself has an implication in terms of how you perform, how you feel, how you connect with other people, how you perceive the world around you. But bigger than that, it also affects your well-being generally, and it can have an impact on relationships. So when we're thinking about stress today, the reason that I wanted us to start by getting acquainted with our stress is because we have to know where we are to be able to think about where we're going. And it's important for us to have a level of self-awareness about how stress shows up for us in our everyday lives now, so that hopefully at the end of this webinar, when we've talked a bit more about the studies that have changed it all and the research that's come out and actually positive stress responses, we can begin to think about our stress differently. We can begin to talk to ourselves differently about our stress, think about our stress differently. We might even stop playing stress ping pong with other people, and we may find that actually the implications of all of this is enhanced well-being and better relationships. When we think about stress and the mind-body connection, as I said before, your mind is the most powerful tool that you have, and it impacts on everything from thoughts and feelings to behaviors. In a typical stress response, in terms of somebody that believes that stress is bad for their health, when they begin to feel those moments of feeling overwhelmed, what we generally find in terms of a bodily response is that the heart rate goes up and the blood vessels constrict. The really interesting thing about the research that's come out recently shows that those people that have a positive stress mindset, that don't believe that stress is bad for their health, whilst they might have an increase in heart rate, which is good, and we've realized that from previously where we've said it's pumping that oxygenated blood around your body to prepare you for action, they don't have constricted blood vessels. That's not showing in terms of their health scans. And the really important thing about that is that it's the constriction of blood vessels that leads to cardiovascular issues related to stress. So when we talk in really broad terms about stress causing heart attacks, it's usually because those blood vessels constrict continuously over time the more stressed we are, and it makes it much more difficult for blood to get around the body, and that leads to health implications. But actually, when you have a positive stress mindset, your blood vessels are relaxed, which means that you are not suffering from any of the negative health implications of a usual stress response. In fact, in those moments, it's the same bodily response that we see in moments of joy and in moments of courage, which is a bit of a game changer when we think about stress, that actually our body's response when we don't believe that stress is bad for us is the same response that we have in moments of courage. It is your body preparing you to be the best version of yourself. I've talked about your stress mindset changing the way that your body responds to it. And actually, the important thing about that is that maintaining a positive stress mindset could be the difference between decades more of good health. If you have a mindset that doesn't believe that stress is bad for you, and you have bodily responses where you have relaxed blood vessels, you are not suffering from the negative health implications of stress. And that's huge in terms of holistic well-being. One of the things that I want to talk to you about today that's also come out of the study is oxytocin. And this is really important. Oxytocin is also known by a kind of cute little nickname called the cuddle hormone. And it's a neurohormone that fine-tunes your brain's social instincts. The really interesting thing about oxytocin in your stress response is that it's as much a part of it as adrenaline is. Oftentimes when we think about a stress response, we only ever think about fight or flight. And both of those things, almost even when you talk about them, make people feel agitated because neither of them sound particularly good. It's like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place when you're stressed. But the reality is that there is a third option there. It might be fight, flight, or cuddle, if we're going to use the nickname that we call oxytocin. But it's interesting that we never talk about it. The really important point about oxytocin being part of your stress response is that it's your body wanting you to be surrounded by people who care about you. So what happens when you have a stress response is that actually your body, as well as pumping adrenaline around, also pumps oxytocin around. And it's trying to get you to connect with other people. It's literally pumping that feeling around your body. And it also gets better because oxytocin also protects our cardiovascular system from stress-induced damage. It's a natural anti-inflammatory, which is incredible because when we think about stress in our bodies, we've often only talked about the negative implications of it. But actually, oxytocin is protecting your body from stress-induced damage. Sharing and caring can actually be life-saving. So when you are feeling stressed, your body is urging you to connect with other people, to reach out for help. And all too often, what happens when we get caught in this negative stress cycle and a mindset that believes that stress can only be bad for us is that when we begin to feel those moments of stress coming, we start to isolate from other people. How many times have you found yourself in a situation where you've had a bad day and you felt stressed? And you may well have had plans with people and you've wanted to put them off so that you could go home and be by yourself. But actually, on the days that you haven't been able to, and you've had to meet up with friends regardless of how you're feeling, I can imagine that for many people, you've come away from that saying, I'm so glad I did that. I feel so much better. And a large part of that is because your stress response wants you to reach out. It wants you to share how you're feeling, and it wants you to get the comfort and the connection of other people. We are in a situation right now where we have been in lockdown for months now. We are starting to transition out, and we're starting to think about reconnecting with the people that we care about. So if there was ever a time to talk about the importance of connection in stress, it's right now, when we have the opportunity to start reconnecting with loved ones and with family members and with friends, because actually that in itself can be a life-saving response for us. One of the things that I wanted to talk about today is thinking about, when we talk about stress, we need to find the meaning in it. We need to ask ourselves, what is it that I care about that's at stake here? It's too easy to get too caught up in thinking negatively about stress all the time. But actually, the research tells us really, really clearly that changing your mindset changes your stress response in your body. And actually, the more you engage in a positive stress mindset, the better your body responds each and every time you feel stressed moving forward. The more oxytocin it will produce, the more it will urge you to connect with other people, and the faster you will feel like you are moving past stress. It's a difficult time right now for everybody. And it's fair to say that there have probably been moments over the last few weeks and months where you felt completely overwhelmed and probably quite anxious about what's to come. But if there's nothing that you leave with in terms of today other than this, it's the recognition that when you think differently about stress, you have the power to change how stress affects you and how it impacts you. And part of that is also being able to share that knowledge with other people. Well-being is about community. When we feel well, we empower other people around us to feel well too. And so learning differently about stress means that you are now able to empower other people to think differently about their stress response. For too long, we've made stress the enemy. We've talked about it with really negative language and terminology. I myself, as a practitioner, have spent many hours in seminars and on webinars telling people to avoid it at all costs, telling them that they need to find ways to manage it. But actually, as I said earlier in the webinar, those people that have the highest levels of well-being also have the highest levels of stress. And that means that they have the most amount of meaning in their lives. Sure, things can feel overwhelming, things can come at you all at once, and it might feel like it's hard to cope with everything that's going on. But getting rid of all of those things would probably get rid of most of the meaning and the purpose and the joy that you find in your life. So over the next few weeks or months, when it starts to potentially feel like it's all getting too much, one of the things that I really want to encourage you to do is to start thinking about, what is the meaning that my stress brings to me? What is it that I care about? And actually thinking about it in that way will support you in being able to increase your well-being and increase the way that you view your ability to handle stress and your self-confidence and your self-awareness. And all of those things are incredibly important to holistic well-being as a whole. So moving on from today and today's webinar, if there's anything more that you feel you want to know about a difference in a stress response and the way that research has changed the game in the way that we think about stress, please do search Kelly McGonigal and have a look at the research that she's done in finding the upside in stress.